Okay, hello everybody. We are going to do a mock interview and we're going to introduce ourselves and then I'll say just a little something about the interview. So off you go, Chris.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Chris Salamone and I teach early modern literature, which includes Shakespeare.
Catherine?
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm a first year English student here at Mansfield.
And I'm Lucinda. I'm also an English tutor. I teach medieval literature. So Chris and I are both working with Catherine at the moment, so we see her every week. So we know each other better than most people would do who are having an interview. So this may feel more relaxed than you might feel when you come into your interview. The things we just thought we'd say a couple of things about how the interview is going to go. We've got a poem which we're going to put up on the screen in just a moment, and we're going to work with that. And then we're going to ask a couple of questions, kind of one of them particularly related to something that Catherine said in her personal statement about what she reads and how she likes to read. When we're doing interviews, we have in front of us a kind of the interview criteria and the kind of overall criteria for candidates applying for English. And there is also all the kind of written work which we have from candidates which we've marked, and so we'll have some criteria for what we kind of how we assess that, and then we'll also have particular interview criteria. So in relation to the written work, we're looking for students' attention to sort of literary aspects of text, the way they make an argument, how precise they are. When it comes to interview, we're asking for some similar things, but we're looking for evidence of things like independent reading, sort of ability to sort of build on ideas. If you ability to be sort of flexible in discussion and kind of come up with examples when we ask for examples. If you haven't looked at them, look at the criteria on the admissions website for the different subjects, but look particularly for English if you're coming for an English interview. So that will be in our mind, and that's what we'll be making notes in relation to as we go through the interview. We're trying to sort of use the interview for something more than any other material we get on the candidate from their UCAS statement or a test or their written work. Okay, so we're going to kick off and we're going to start with a poem. We usually start with poem in Mansfield interviews because we think we've given it to people in advance, and we think they otherwise might be kind of like sitting there with this kind of torn document covered in writing, kind of worrying about it and be thinking about it. So we like to get that out of the way first. And there it is in Catherine's hand. So behind the scenes, we have Sarah, who's going to put the poem up for us. So would you do that, Sarah? Okay, so Sarah's very kindly put the poem up for us. So we don't usually read it out, I don't think, in interviews, but I'm going to read it out because I think that might be helpful for anybody watching. So it's called The Making, and it's after Shita Patel. Make it out of those scraps of attention your father scattered across your timeline. The 2 times he came to see you on stage, the 1 time he visited you at university. Gather them and add to the scrapbook of love, advice and guidance from uncles. How Uncle D told you a relationship relies on compromise. How Uncle T showed you that even when falling apart, you can still make small but significant repairs for others. Make your mother the spine to this book. Make it sing kind words. Make it to find out what words can fix and what they cannot. Make it for your mother's approval. Make it selfishly sometimes. Make it in secret, in public, in meditation and prayer. Make it a prayer. Pray to the earth, the universe, the light inside yourself. Make it a mantra. Make it to forgive yourself. Make it to fix what's been broken. When you break, make no apologies. I'm sorry, I didn't read that very well. But, maybe we can talk about how difficult it is to read. So, Catherine, would you sort of give us your first thoughts? What first strikes you about the poem?
Yeah, I think the first thing I was really interested by was kind of the ambiguity of what she means by make it. Because like throughout the poem, I don't think it's entirely clear. In the first line, you have the kind of make it out, which that phrase isolated suggests a kind of like escape from something, but then you see that she's actually talking about kind of making something out of something. And then that kind of continues in the rest of the poem where, she says like make it to find out what words can fix, and you're not sure if she's saying, make it as in keep going, kind of succeed over this thing, or make something out of this thing. And just on that thought, on making something out of this thing, I think by the time I'd read the poem a couple of times, I kind of got the impression that it was kind of self-aware as a piece of writing. Almost got the impression that it was like maybe the poet talking to herself. You know, she talks about making it sing kind words, and the 2 times that her father came to see her on stage, I thought might have maybe been referring to a performance of some kind. Yeah, almost like she's like self-soothing in assuring herself that what she's doing has a value in some way, perhaps, as a poet.
That's really interesting. I like, I mean, well, 2 things that you started, both the kind of what it means to make in the poem, and how that might, I mean, I kind of like the idea that one could just say it seems to sort of be open and keep changing, and or be uncertain. And also what you said about both sort of her being self-conscious as a poet and also as a performer. First, sort of starting with the last verse, it's kind of interesting. You sort of said that it sounds quite self-soothing. That sounds really contrary to the idea of it being a performance. Could you kind of think about how those 2 might be in tension, or something? What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the last stanza, where she has all the repetition of make it, it kind of lulls you into a rhythm, a kind of comforting one, I felt. But at the same time, that's obviously very constructed. She's like deliberately had to place those make it there. It's not something that's naturally occurring. So that, in a way, I guess, is a performance of sorts. Like she's having to deliberately put those phrases there to comfort herself.
Yeah. No, go on. So go on.
Yeah, I mean, I think whenever I said about the performance, I didn't necessarily mean like the poem as a performance, just the time he visited her at or saw her on stage. Sorry, I was thinking about that as a performance. But yeah, that's interesting, I guess, to think about the way that she's making it appear like something that's like obvious, but when you look at it, she is having to actually place all those phrases there to kind of make those feelings come out.
Yeah, no, that's really nice. And I mean, can I ask another quick question, and then I'll pass on to Chris. I can always feel when Chris is ready to say. I'm desperate to ask this. So you talked about sort of what making means. What does it mean?
Yeah, well, I guess that's what I was unsure of. I mean, I get, in light of the reading of it as a kind of self-aware, you might think about it as being the poem itself or the active writing, but again, if make it just means keep going, then it might just mean, you know, keep going. I think it's interesting. I was struck by how active the making is throughout the whole thing. Like even the poem's title, the making, it's not being described as something already finished. It's very much like a thing in the works. And like even the final line, I thought it was interesting that she doesn't say like don't apologize. She deliberately says make no apologies. So it's all very focused on the act of making, and it's something that a reminder to continue doing that.
Could you say something just briefly about the make that comes at the beginning of the second stanza?
Yes. I could maybe.
I was wondering about it, kind of just thinking about it physically.
Yeah.
Because it seems to be, I mean, there's also that idea of craft, isn't there?
Yeah.
So, make your mother the spine to this book. This book.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting that both the mother and the father are kind of like, the father is, you're being told to gather the things that he's done and add them to a scrapbook, and the mother to a book. So it's very much an attempt to kind of like solidify or put a structure around things that are ultimately fleeting. Like I actually, just on that, I thought it was interesting that she talks about scraps of attention, but she uses the word those. like she's very deliberately trying to grab on to like specific ones,
Yeah.
and then she says like the 2 times he came to see you on stage, the 1 time. So these ultimately kind of insignificant things, it doesn't seem like he was maybe that much of a presence in her life, but they've been so kind of significant that she is grabbing onto them very closely. So I think maybe the mother might be a kind of a similar idea where you know, the spine to this book is a spine is what holds a book together. So she's kind of relying on her mother as being kind of a force of holding her together, maybe.
Construction and no,
Yeah.
interesting. Would you just this is going to be the last thing I ask you, but would you kind of get the poem and just turn it on its side?
I might also be on my side now.
Oh, that's lovely. I was thinking about the idea of a spine and the 2 stanzas.
Oh yeah.
Because I mean, I hadn't thought about this before you were talking about kind of some construction, but it's almost like you could turn it sideways and it's like the 2 pages of a book with a spine down the middle.
Also interesting, I guess, then that the first stanza is about her, not entirely, but focuses on her father, and then the second is on her mother.
Yeah.
And that they're 2 kind of distinct ideas or kind of pages in her book.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's really nice.
Go, Chris.
Yeah, I really love that division you're making there. So that's fantastic. And I mean, a lot of the terms that we've been using, sort of self-aware, self-soothing, it made me think about how the speaker and the addressee, they situated in relation to others. I guess you might start by, I guess that's a big question, isn't it? So you might start by asking, how is the speaker situated? How is the addressee situated? And then what's their relationship to others within the kind of argument of the poem?
Yeah. I think my like initial reading of the poem was that the speaker is speaking to herself in a way. Almost by the end of the poem, I got that impression. Even just something about like how the level of detail that she knows about the kind of person that she's speaking to, it suggests a high degree of intimacy with that person. But yeah, by the end, I think the self-soothing stuff I was talking about, I think, you know, even like the line "make it a mantra," I thought was interesting, because by the time you get to that point in the poem, it kind of seems like the whole poem itself has been that mantra.
And is there something about that stanza, Catherine, that is mantra-like in particular compared to the previous stanza?
Yes, I think all the make it, kind of it's easy to remember. It has a very solid rhythm. I think it feels like an incantation. Kind of feels like someone like saying it to themselves. Feels like something they're like carrying around, having at their disposal. Also, just on the like who they're speaking to, I thought it was interesting as well that the in the last like 3 lines, but the 2 lines before the final line, they both start with yourself. So they don't just say you. There's a very, I think, deliberate emphasis on it being yourself, which made me think maybe they were talking to themselves.
Okay, yeah, and I think I love how the kind of the evidence for that is in the kind of the familial intimacy you've described, and I guess we locate that mostly in the first stanza, don't we? It's just something about the language of the first stanza that is indicative of a kind of a sort of intimate knowledge of a personal sort of background or timeline.
Yeah. Well, I get even just, you know, the awareness of the times, the specific events with the father. Also, like the familiarity of Uncle D or Uncle T. Also, I thought it's interesting when she's talking about the father, it's very much in the past tense, but the advice that Uncle D and Uncle T has given her are both quite active, so a relationship relies on compromise, and that even when falling apart, you can still make, and so on. So I think that kind of suggests that the speaker is still kind of actively thinking about those things a lot. which I guess suggests a degree of like proximity to those ideas.
Yeah, good. Let's think about that father figure then. So make it out of those scraps of attention your father scattered across your timeline. The 2 times he came to see you on stage, the 1 time he visited you at university. So what kind of dynamic is just sort of being constructed here? How would you describe it, or how is it characterized?
I guess the impression I got was definitely like one of distance.
Okay.
There isn't a huge degree of familiarity or like warmth, I think.
Yeah. And what about
scattered is quite an indifferent word, I thought.
Yeah.
And even like your father and his actual actions being quite separated is interesting. Maybe like when she's talking about the things he's actually done, he's just he came to see you, he visited you. It doesn't really suggest that they were ever that close, I don't think. They're also the things she's mentioning are quite like big life events. It's not really about like kind of everyday things you might associate with a relationship as close as that. He came to see her when she was on stage or at university, but not necessarily maybe in between. You kind of get the impression.
Yeah, and so you have, you have that sort of list-like quality of the rare occasions of his.
Yeah, almost like he's been like checking them off.
Yeah. And I mean, things you check off are sort of like to-do lists, or I mean, they gather them and add to the scrapbook. I mean, I'm really struck by the sort of syntax of that. Gather them and add to the scrapbook, not add them to the scrapbook, but add to the scrapbook.
Yeah.
What does that remind you? Does it remind you of a particular genre or sort of discourse or sort of type of register? So 2 times he came to see you, the 1 time he visited, gather them, add the scrapbook.
Yeah, I mean, it's very instructional.
Yeah,
I think the add to the scrapbook is quite forceful.
I like that they also go 2-1. You know, it's kind of like the next thing is 0, because after that,
add some eggs and you've got a cake. Yeah, it's like a sort of recipe or instruction or how-to guide, I suppose.
Yeah.
And also, I think gather is quite interesting because it's not. Gather suggests that you're kind of having to search for them and grab for them instead of them just being readily available.
Yeah.
And
it's nice. I mean, it's nice also that kind of like if you then follow the line and you take the scrapbook of love, then love doesn't really sit in the lines with stuff to do with the father, but it goes to the advice and guidance from uncle. So it's a scrapbook of love, but that's not sort of where dad's stuff is.
Exactly.
I really liked what you were saying there, and the kind of the 2 times, the 1 time, and what you're saying about sort of the slightly sort of public activity of the father compared with the told you and showed you from the uncles, which sound a bit more kind of intimate. No, it's a very good. Sorry, go on.
And just lastly, to go back to the bigger question I asked about the relationship between the self and others. I mean, are there lines here, particularly in the second stanza, I suppose, where the relationship of the speaker to others, besides the mother, are apparent within the kind of larger argument of what's being, of the advice that's being given?
Yes, I think it's interesting, the line about making it to find out what words can fix and what they cannot. You're not really sure if they're talking about fixing something for themselves or for others, which is, I guess, interesting. But then you have the make it selfishly sometimes, which maybe contradicts that and suggesting that it is kind of, I don't want to say self-indulgent, feels like the wrong word, but the whole poem does feel like they're kind of focusing on it being very much a process for themselves. They talk about making it, well, both in secret and in public.
And
interesting.
That's brilliant, Catherine. I'm struck, but to make it selfishly, I mean, we have that enjambment there. I want, if just lastly before we wrap up, really, we might think about the kind of the formal arrangement a bit more. You've identified brilliantly the kind of sort of the spine of the poem, the spine of the scrapbook at the centre, and in terms of the run of the lines. So make it secret in public, in meditation and prayer. Make it a prayer. Pray to the earth, the universe, for light inside. The next line, yourself. Make it a mantra. Make it to forgive. And then the next line, yourself. Could you say something about the formal arrangement of the language there?
Yes. I mean, obviously, there's a contrast between where she's quite deliberately, I think, chosen to have the short, snappier, like make it a prayer, full stop. Seems like a very kind of dry, clear-cut instruction. But then the ones that have the enjambment, I think that line in particular, the make it to forgive, and then with the comma, yourself, is really striking, I think, because that, talking about like her relationship to others or to herself, that line almost suggests that there is like a duality where she's making it to forgive more generally, maybe making it to forgive her father or her mother or whoever, but then she ultimately brings it back to yourself, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, fantastic. I like how you brought it back round to that first stanza's initial subject, the relationship with the father, which makes us then rethink that line. So make it to fix what's broken. We return back to the scraps, the scattered scraps. Yeah, great. Thank you.
The last break, when you break, make no apologies, almost kind of also kind of end of the poem as well, which is kind of really nice. It does that. I mean, I think I like the idea that it's the poet writing about what she's doing as well. There's a kind of there's something really nice about the creative obviousness somewhere. Do you like it?
I do like it. I like it more than the one I had last year. Yeah, I do like it.
Yeah, it was one of the ones we used last year, actually. You were just unlucky not to get it.
Oh, yeah.
Is it like anything else you've read? Can you kind of think, okay, this falls into something you expect from poems, or?
Well, I think a lot of poets are quite interested in writing about poetry. In the kind of writing process, I think a lot of them are quite self-conscious about poetry as an act, and whether it's kind of ultimately useful. So a lot of the time you see them kind of battling that out in their work, trying to decide what the I guess like what the greater good of their work is. That's like definitely a theme I've noticed in other poetry I've read.
Anything particularly that you like that you've read that does that, do you think?
I think, well, just this term we've been doing like the Victorian poets, and a kind of key thing that's been coming up in our lectures is that a lot of them were really self-conscious about the role of poetry in a time when there was obviously like a lot of growing advancements in science and lots of things kind of rapidly changing in the world. They were kind of had to turn inward and think, oh, we're poets, what's the point of that anymore? But obviously there is a point to that. I'm trying to think of a specific example. Honestly, well, he's not a Victorian poet at all, but I think Seamus Heaney, I love Seamus Heaney, and I think it's really obvious in his work that he's very much constantly thinking about his role as a poet, what it means to be a poet, especially what it means to be a poet from like a rural background, and what he's always kind of trying to reconcile his rural background with his poetic nature, I think. So he has poems where he very explicitly says, like he has one about a conversation with an old man where the old man is constantly kind of asking him for his opinions and saying, you're supposed to be a learned man, you're a poet, and he very deliberately steers the conversation away from that because he doesn't want to be pretentious or be seen as some kind of poet espousing his opinions all the time. But then in his work he can do that, and he's more comfortable doing that in his work.
Okay, no, that's really nice. Can I ask I've got one more question, then I'll pass to Chris for something that came up in your personal statement we really want to talk about. When thinking back to when you were still in school, college, and you were just starting A-level You can then remember back another year to what it was like to be doing GCSE. If you, from now, if you could recommend a book to make people at year 10 choose to do English literature A level, what book would you recommend them?
Ooh.
I ask this question a lot.
Yeah, that's a good question.
For anybody who wants to hear this.
Yeah. I think, okay, does it have to be a book? Can it be a play?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No. Yeah, no, it doesn't
Okay.
have to be a novel or anything. No, it could be a poem if you want. No.
Yeah. I think a play might be a good idea because with a play you can always make them watch it, which I think is always a good way to kind of get people interested in a piece of writing, make it come to life more than it can appear to be in the classroom. I know maybe this is like a silly answer, but so we did A Streetcar Named Desire, which I loved. And I think any play that has elements that might be seen as kind of like, maybe, I don't know, like risque or salacious in some way, are genuinely good at keeping a classroom's attention. Because, first of all, it makes the writing, I don't know, I guess we might have some kind of conceptions of any writing from the past as being dusty or like in black and white. And when you read a play like that is so like kind of throbbing with energy, it forces you to dispel those kind of beliefs. Also, maybe just something that comes from like a time period or a location that's very unfamiliar to the class, because that is always just interesting. I think like learning about New Orleans and the kind of post-war period was very interesting for us. Yeah, I think a play is a good idea though, because I think watching a play and watching it being performed well can really do a lot to make you engage with the text.
And would you get them to perform it as well?
Yes, I think I would. I know some people might find that uncomfortable, but we did, and I always found that really beneficial because, again, I mean, first of all, it just like increases engagement. I think it doesn't allow you to be like falling asleep at your desk, but also, saying the words out loud does make you, I think, even things like rhythm and when you're considering the words on the page and why the writer has put them in the order that they have, there's a lot to be said for reading it out loud. And
it's interesting. Yeah, sorry, go on.
No,
I was going to say the Streetcar is also really interesting. I really like the fact that you said both watch and read and perform as a possible too, because Streetcar obviously also has all those kind of stage directions, which are all quite all very much like stage directions in some very kind of directional. They were, Over to Chris.
Yeah, and I guess I have two questions now. One which segues very nicely from what you've just been discussing, Catherine. So, and I was interested in your personal statement and your description of the difference between poetry and drama. If you can hark back to your personal statement. And you mentioned the difficulty, or you suggest the difficulty of interpreting texts. You say is diminished by what you refer to as the equalizing platform of the stage. And I wondered if you could sort of unpack what might be meant by that phrase, the equalizing platform of the stage. And maybe even now, how might we rethink or problematize the idea of the stage as an equalizing platform?
Yeah, I know. I was just going to say, it's interesting being read back something I wrote a year ago, because I'm like, do I agree with that anymore? I think,
well, didn't you?
Yeah.
I think it's beautiful phrase, Catherine.
No, I like it.
Well, I think what I meant by it at the time, have to answer for my past self now, was, so I remember I read a really good essay by Virginia Woolf. I can't remember what it's called, but it was really good. Where she basically was talking about dramatists and saying that, you know, they can have all these huge lofty ideas and they can be really intellectual in their work, but ultimately at the end of the day, whether their work is a success or not, whether we can deem their work as a success or not, is based on if they entertained us. Which I think, yes, I think that's what I meant when you go see a play. You know, when you're sitting with a work of poetry, you can really kind of you know, even for like the 15 minutes that I had the poem before this, you sit with it, you reread the lines, you can consider why, you know, certain lines flow over into others. But with a poem, you don't have those moments of pause, or sorry, with a play, you don't have those moments of pause. So there is a kind of demand for it to just constantly be keeping you engaged.
So the kind of the forward momentum, the kind of the lack of stasis is what you're referring to there. Yeah.
I think there obviously are forms of theatre that are very challenging and that you won't immediately be entertained by. So I don't necessarily agree with what I said before, but I think that's what I meant by it at the time.
Yeah. I mean, have you encountered any plays where the idea of it being staged, the very act or fact of it being staged, might actually add layers of interpretive complexity rather than equalize or diminish the difficulty?
Yeah. I mean, I think any kind of staging where it's a kind of modern retelling is always gonna do that. To think of an example. This isn't a play, but it's the adaptation of the Romeo and Juliet, the film. I think is maybe a good example of that. Yeah, it's obviously it's a crazy film. Like it's so bombastic and kind of mental. But it also
this is the Baz Luhrmann.
Yeah.
No, I love it. Yeah.
It's so good.
Yeah, fantastic.
But at the same time, it's just the text. Like they don't actually stray from the text at all. It's all in the costume, the characterization, the way that the actors choose to perform it, the setting, that I think makes the text really come alive in a way that it hadn't for me whenever I had read the play.
And that's an example, isn't it, Catherine, of something that's, I mean, it's equalizing in that it brings the text, the Shakespearean text, to a kind of pop culture level. I'm thinking in particular of its soundtrack, but also its setting. But also, I mean, I guess it adds new texts to it. You know, those songs will have lyrics, for example.
Yeah.
And
I guess it doesn't have to be just that film. Any production that's adding anything is doing that in a way, incorporating new elements.
I think and lastly, and you mentioned Woolf earlier, and perhaps it's the same essay that Woolf wrote, but you mentioned in the personal statement that Woolf sort of conceives of the act of reading, or the idea of the reader, as the author's fellow worker or accomplice, which is a lovely image, isn't it?
Yeah.
And elsewhere in your personal statement, you mentioned that you're looking forward to literary study as a kind of process of dissection. So you've got sort of the reading as labor, as worker, or as accomplice, or as dissection. These are really great metaphors for how we engage with texts. And I wondered whether you'd encountered works of literature that very particularly or distinctly set up or shape reading practices. So ideal or implied or necessary reading practices, how we might or should read a work.
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I think poetry might be like a good place to look to answer that question, because I think poetry, I think, can be so like terrifying whenever you feel like you don't know anything about it. Okay. But the minute you start to get your head around some of the kind of forms and kind of typical conventions of poetry, you really start to think you have like an access point into it. Like I'm just thinking, for example, of, you know, whenever you learn that a sonnet is 14 lines, that opens up, I think, so much for you in terms of knowing what a 14-line poem, what the implications of that are, but also knowing what the implications of a poem being 15 lines or, you know, 13 lines are. And I think, just that in general, understanding why a poet has chosen or not chosen to use certain, you know, like if they've chosen to use iambic pentameter, why they might have done that, understanding that it belongs in like a broader literary context.
I love. I mean, it's a great answer, isn't it? I mean, thinking about how form, the shape of the poem, shapes our approach to it, and almost sort of tells us, which tools to pick up as we dissect.
And it's really interesting so when I often think of kind of reading when people practice for the ELAT or when we talk about reading poetry for students, I often think about kind of trying to get a sort of like a hole to find your way in order to kind of like move around. And when you did the poem, you started off with, well, make is used a lot. So what's going on here? And that is the kind of hole in. And then there's so many implications come from that afterwards that it's there's some kind of there's some labor and craft in that, kind of working one's way through those things. That's great. Do you have another question there, Chris, or you?
No, I don't. No.
Do you have any questions for us, Catherine? We always ask at the end if candidates have questions.
No, I don't think so.
Well, obviously Catherine doesn't need to have any questions because we've been working together, and any questions she has that she can come and ask us when we're sitting in class together. So good luck to everybody who's doing interviews this year, and we hope to see you as we see Catherine every week after we see you for interview. Thanks so much, Catherine. It's a weird thing to have to do, but thank you very much for doing it. It's
I know,
really
good luck, everyone. I remember exactly how I felt. It's very scary. It'll be grand.
Not scary, Catherine.
No, sorry, it's not scary.
Nice.
Okay. Not scary.
Okay.
Thanks, Catherine. It was great. Great. Brilliant.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Yeah, so we thought, Chris and I thought after I suggested this, so I'm putting Chris on the spot here, that when we did that interview with Catherine, all the way through, I was thinking, oh, I want to explain why this really is good. I want to explain what happened there a little bit. And so I guess I thought perhaps we could say a couple of things about then what happens afterwards when we're talking about a candidate and you know, we've made notes and how to think, the kind of things we might pick up of that about that interview. Do you want to start, Chris? Is there something that particularly struck you as a kind of first thing? And I've got some things written down as well.
Yeah, I mean, so I really liked Catherine's initial sort of attention to particular phrases like "make it," and that was a really nice route into analysing the poem, and it opens up so much. So, sort of being able to then build on that over the length of the discussion was really impressive, I think. And also, I really like the kind of her reading of the form, particularly at the close of the of the discussion. Her sort of consideration of an genre worked brilliantly. So there was a real kind of analytic clarity to a lot of what she said, but also just off the bat, you know, Catherine mentioned that this poem seems really self-aware, which is absolutely my sort of my response to the poem as well, really. And then once she sort of identified that, then you can start to think about, okay, how is this a poem that's in some ways about language, about the efficacy of language. Yeah, those are my initial thoughts. I thought it was a really successful reading of the poem, and particularly, I mean, some of the questions I posed about, you know, can you situate the speaker and the addressee? I think she gave an interpretation, i.e., it's a speaker addressing herself, and then, which was brilliant, gave evidence for that. Gave throughout the poem, sort of pinpointed particular lines. So she responded to quite a tricky question, I think, with precision.
Yeah. No, I think I guess for anybody watching, is obviously she's been working at university for a term, and she's got very used to talking about writing, and almost no interview that we do is so smooth and has somebody who's able to kind of recall and find examples and express, you know, kind of ideas about examples so quickly. So that was a kind of pretty stellar performance, really. I suppose, yeah, building on what Chris said, I really liked her, that whenever one asked her anything, she could kind of go into a precise example. And I think very often, we didn't have to ask Catherine this, but very often every other question I ask is a kind of, can you give me an example of that? You know, kind of, can you say where you see that? I very much liked also the way that she, whatever the question was, she took a moment to think. You know, we know, you know, we work with Catherine, we know she's quite chatty, but she also is kind of able to not feel like she needs to kind of leap in and say something big, sort of big and general. She kind of really stuck to what the question was, listened to the question and then answer the question. And I think that's a really good thing, that candidates might think you don't have to worry that you need to make some grand claims about literature, kind of just go with what you're being asked. I mean, I suppose the other thing was that Chris and I spoke before the interview about how much we liked Catherine's personal statement. And she said some really interesting things, which were, and people will write things sometimes, for instance, we have to admit, we hadn't read many of the books which were on Catherine's personal statement, because her reading interests are, Chris does Shakespeare and early modern stuff. I do medieval stuff. I kind of like, I haven't read lots of those books. So I didn't feel quite so confident asking her to kind of talk about some of the details of her reading as I might do if, if she'd read some things lots of things I'd read. But she said some things about the way she thought about writing and the way she thought about literature, which made it really easy for us to ask questions. So the question you asked about, kind of ways of reading, about process of reading.
I love Catherine's response there, and sort of bringing it around to ideas of form and genre as sort of prompts for a readerly engagement with the work. Again, what made it so great was the precise example, the sonnet form, which absolutely does kind of ask something of the reader, asks us to be a kind of an accomplice to, but also a kind of surgeon as well, which fits in with her own. It fits in with her own rhetoric. And so, as an exercise, what we did, I suppose, what I did, I picked up some of the metaphors that Catherine had used, and in her personal statement, and sort of tried to see the opportunities for what they suggest about literature more generally. So I suppose it's a good strategy for candidates to look back over their personal statements and see what opportunities we might take up in the interview.
Candidates have given us the personal statement, so if you read it, you can see what the questions that we might ask kind of based on the personal statement. I think that there is something something very interesting in it. So I think lots of interviews, people might expect interviews to move from thing to thing very quickly, but actually there were lots of ways in which the whole interview was sort of about some of the same things all the time. It was sort of about kind of reading, close reading, and then about how one reads, and then about how one might think about how other people read, or how literature might have an impact on other people, other than oneself, as it were. So there was a bit of we're not necessarily trying to think of a plan for the interview, but we will always have a kind of few questions we're ready very specific to the candidate in front of us. So
I suppose it's sort of it might be worth pointing out some of the things which we didn't sort of get around to discussing, or questions which we sort of habitually or find useful to ask. We didn't hear because we know Catherine very well, and so, for instance, asking her about her wider reading it's quite difficult when Catherine's doing a lot of wider reading right now. We know what it is already.
An entire term of Victorian literature,
it doesn't quite, and sort of ideas of love and appreciation of literature. We've kind of we know that of Catherine quite well. So those are criteria as well, which we can ask questions of.
Absolutely. And also we ask about the written work, but that just seemed really unfair. It's kind of like Catherine had written it such a long time ago that it seemed a bit unfair to say, like, why did you write this? And when she's been writing us like an essay or more a week for the last 8 weeks. Brilliant. Okay, thanks very much. I hope that's kind of useful for kind of us thinking about a review. In the thinking about the sort of like the criteria that I mentioned, if you go back and look at, if anybody watching this goes back and has a look at what those criteria are, it'd be really interesting, I think, for you to listen to the interview and then think, kind of how those criteria met. She met the criteria really well. It was a really, really good performance.
For example, when we think about flexibility, the way in which the candidate responds flexibly to the questions that we pose, and the way in which we sort of give the opportunity to rethink statements, have another watch through the interview and see how that's happening.
Thank you very much. Right, we're going to go now, and good luck with your interviews, and we hope to see some of you soon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Take care. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.